Jerome Lewis turned the key in the ignition of his peculiar-looking truck, and instead of the expected rumble of a combustion engine, a soft, electric whir filled the air, followed by something else entirely, a quiet hiss that made the visiting automotive executive freeze in place. The man's eyes widened as he watched steam rise gently from beneath the hood, and suddenly every joke his coworkers had made about that rusty vehicle evaporated into stunned silence. What happened next would transform this quiet mechanic's life in ways nobody could have predicted, but the real question was whether Jerome was ready for what fame and fortune would demand from him. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning sun had barely crested over the Detroit skyline when Jerome Lewis pulled his truck into the parking lot of Martinez Auto Repair on a Tuesday in late September. The vehicle coughed and wheezed as it rolled to a stop. Its exterior a patchwork of mismatched paint colors ranging from primer gray to rust orange, with what appeared to be hand-welded modifications covering nearly every surface. To anyone watching, it looked like something that should have been sent to the scrapyard a decade ago. A mechanical Frankenstein's monster that defied both logic and good taste. Marcus Jennings was the first to spot Jerome's arrival that morning, and as had become tradition over the past 6 months, he immediately called out to the others. His voice carried across the shop floor with practiced ease, drawing the attention of every mechanic who was already buried under the hood of some customer's vehicle. The ritual had become so predictable that some of the guys had started placing informal bets on who would get the first laugh of the day. "Hey everybody, the professor just pulled up in his science experiment again," Marcus announced, his broad shoulders shaking with laughter as he gestured toward the parking lot through the bay doors. The nickname had stuck after someone overheard Jerome muttering about chemical reactions and energy conversion while he tinkered with his truck during lunch breaks. To the crew at Martinez Auto Repair, it was just another sign that Jerome was a bit too odd for his own good, too lost in his own world of theories and calculations to fit in with regular working men. Danny Rodriguez wiped the grease from his hands onto his already stained coveralls and walked over to get a better look. He had been working at the shop for 15 years and had seen plenty of strange vehicles roll through those doors, but nothing quite compared to what Jerome drove. The thing looked like it had been assembled from parts salvaged from 3 different vehicles, none of which had any business being connected to each other. There were tubes and tanks bolted to the frame in ways that made no conventional sense, and the whole contraption seemed to vibrate with an energy that Danny couldn't quite place. "Man, I don't know how that thing even passes inspection," Danny said, shaking his head with a mixture of amusement and genuine bewilderment. He had tried asking Jerome about the modifications once, but the explanation had been so filled with technical jargon and scientific terms that Danny had given up halfway through. It was easier to just laugh along with everyone else than to try to understand whatever Jerome was attempting to accomplish. Jerome stepped out of his truck with the same quiet dignity he carried every day, his tall frame unfolding from the driver's seat with practiced ease. At 42 years old, he had the kind of weathered face that spoke of long nights and hard work, with gray already threading through his close-cropped hair despite his relatively young age. His coveralls were always clean at the start of the day, pressed with a care that seemed almost military in its precision, and his work boots were polished to a dull shine that lasted until about 10 minutes into the first job. He had learned long ago not to respond to the jokes. Defending himself only invited more mockery, and trying to explain what he had built would only make him sound like he was bragging, or, worse, like he was crazy. So instead, Jerome simply nodded to his coworkers with a small smile that never quite reached his eyes, grabbed his lunch bag from the passenger seat, and made his way into the shop. The comments followed him like a persistent shadow, but he had developed a thick skin over the months since he had started driving his invention to work. The interior of Martinez Auto Repair was exactly what you would expect from a shop that had been operating in the same location since the 1980s. The walls were covered with calendars from parts suppliers, some dating back years, and the concrete floor was stained with decades of oil and transmission fluid that no amount of cleaning could ever fully remove. The smell of gasoline and solvent hung permanently in the air, mixing with the metallic tang of welding and the bitter aroma of burnt coffee from the pot that stayed on all day in the break room. Raymond Martinez, the shop's owner, was a stocky man in his late 50s, who had built his business through a combination of honest work and treating his employees fairly. He paid decent wages by industry standards, never asked anyone to work off the clock, and genuinely seemed to care about the people who worked for him. But even Raymond couldn't help but chuckle when he saw Jerome's truck each morning, though his laughter was gentler than that of the younger mechanics who worked under him. "Jerome, I swear one of these days that thing is going to explode in my parking lot," Raymond called out as Jerome passed by the office. There was no real malice in his voice, just the comfortable ribbing of a boss who had known his employee long enough to take certain liberties. Raymond had hired Jerome 3 years ago after being impressed by how quickly the man could diagnose problems that stumped other mechanics, but he had never quite understood Jerome's obsession with his personal vehicle project. Jerome paused at the office door, his hand resting lightly on the frame. For just a moment, something flickered across his face, a combination of pride and frustration that anyone paying close attention might have caught. But Raymond was already looking back down at his paperwork, and the moment passed without notice. Jerome's voice when he spoke was steady and professional, betraying none of the emotions churning beneath the surface. "It's perfectly safe, Raymond. I've run all the calculations multiple times," Jerome replied, his tone carrying the patience of someone who had explained this many times before to people who weren't really listening. He had wanted to say more, to tell Raymond that what sat in that parking lot represented 5 years of research and development, thousands of dollars invested from his modest salary, and a breakthrough that could change everything. But he had said similar things before, and nobody had taken him seriously. The day proceeded much as every other day at the shop. Jerome worked on a transmission replacement for a Honda Accord, diagnosed a mysterious electrical problem in a Ford F-150 that had stumped Danny for 2 days, and helped Marcus figure out why a supposedly simple brake job had turned into a nightmare of seized bolts and stripped threads. He was good at his work, meticulous in a way that customers appreciated even if they never knew his name. The cars that Jerome touched always seemed to run a little better, last a little longer, as if his attention to detail somehow transferred to the machines themselves. During his lunch break, Jerome did what he always did. While the other mechanics gathered in the break room to eat sandwiches and watch whatever sports highlights were playing on the small television mounted in the corner, Jerome took his carefully packed lunch. A thermos of soup his mother had made, and a container of leftovers from last night's dinner, and ate alone in his truck. It wasn't that he disliked his coworkers exactly, but the constant jokes had created a distance that felt impossible to bridge. Out in his truck, surrounded by his creation, Jerome could think clearly without the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. He pulled out a worn notebook from beneath the passenger seat, its pages filled with calculations and diagrams that represented years of work. The hydrogen fuel cell system he had designed wasn't entirely original. The basic science had been understood for decades, but what Jerome had managed to do was solve the efficiency and storage problems that had kept the technology from being practical for everyday vehicles. His system could generate hydrogen on demand through electrolysis, powered by a combination of solar panels integrated into the vehicle's surface and a small battery pack that recharged during operation. The hydrogen was then immediately fed into a fuel cell that produced electricity to drive the motor, with the only byproduct being pure water vapor. The beauty of the system was its elegance. Traditional hydrogen vehicles required expensive infrastructure for fuel production and storage, massive tanks to hold the highly volatile gas, and complex safety systems to prevent catastrophic failures. Jerome's design bypassed almost all of those problems by producing the hydrogen only as needed and in quantities too small to be dangerous. It was simultaneously simpler and more sophisticated than anything currently on the market, and he absolutely knew, that it could work on a larger scale if only someone would take him seriously. But who was going to listen to a mechanic from Detroit about revolutionary automotive technology? The big companies had research and development departments staffed with engineers who had degrees from prestigious universities, people with credentials and connections that Jerome could never hope to match. He had tried reaching out to a few companies over the years, sending detailed letters explaining his invention, but the responses, when they came at all, were always the same polite form. Letters thanking him for his interest and informing him that the company was not accepting unsolicited proposals at this time. Jerome closed the notebook and looked out through his windshield at the shop where he had spent the last 3 years of his life. It was honest work, and he was grateful for it, but sometimes the frustration of knowing what he had accomplished and being unable to share it with the world felt like a weight sitting on his chest. His mother, God rest her soul, had always told him that patient people were rewarded in time, that good things came to those who worked hard and stayed true to their principles. Jerome wanted to believe that, but at 42 years old, he sometimes wondered if time was running out on his chance to make a difference. The afternoon brought a steady stream of customers and the usual problems that came with them. A woman came in, insisting that her car was making a terrible noise, but when Jerome test drove it, everything sounded perfectly normal. A man argued that the estimate for his repairs was too high. Despite Raymond patiently explaining that they were actually charging less than most shops in the area would for the same work. These small dramas played out against the backdrop of air tools and the sharp smell of welding, the everyday symphony of an auto repair shop that had been playing the same tune for decades. It was around 3 in the afternoon when a sleek black luxury sedan pulled into the parking lot, immediately standing out among the working-class vehicles that typically came through. Jerome was underneath a Chevrolet Tahoe at the time, replacing the oil pan that had been damaged by the owner hitting debris on the highway, so he didn't see the car arrive. But Marcus noticed, and he immediately nudged Danny and pointed toward the vehicle with unconcealed interest. "Check out that ride," Marcus said, whistling low under his breath. The sedan was a top-of-the-line German model, the kind of car that cost more than most of the mechanics at Martinez Auto Repair made in a year. Its paint gleamed in the afternoon sun, so perfect and unblemished that it seemed almost unreal, like a computer rendering brought to life. The windows were tinted dark enough that nobody could see who was inside, adding an air of mystery to the vehicle's arrival. The driver's door opened, and a man in an expensive suit stepped out, looking somewhat out of place among the industrial surroundings of the auto shop. He was perhaps 50 years old, with silver hair perfectly styled, and shoes that probably cost more than Jerome's entire wardrobe. Everything about him spoke of wealth and power, from the way he carried himself to the subtle but unmistakable signs of quality in his clothing and accessories. This was not someone who had simply wandered into Martinez Auto Repair by accident. Raymond emerged from his office, his demeanor shifting instantly into professional mode as he approached the unexpected visitor. Years of running a business had taught him to recognize when someone important had arrived, even if he didn't yet know who they were or what they wanted. He wiped his hands on a shop rag and extended one to the suited man with a welcoming smile that was only slightly uncertain around the edges. "Afternoon, sir. I'm Raymond Martinez, owner of this establishment. What can we do for you today?" Raymond's voice carried the careful politeness of someone who knew this person was probably out of their usual element, but wanted to make sure they felt welcome anyway. It wasn't often that someone driving a car worth 6 figures came to a neighborhood shop like this instead of going to the dealership for service. The man shook Raymond's hand with a firm grip that suggested confidence without aggression. His smile was professional but not unkind, the expression of someone who spent a lot of time meeting new people and had learned to put them at ease. When he spoke, his voice had the clear enunciation of someone who had either gone to very good schools or had worked hard to eliminate any trace of regional accent from his speech. "Alexander Chen, VP of Advanced Development at Pinnacle Motors," the man said, producing a business card from his jacket pocket with practiced ease. The card was printed on heavy stock with elegant lettering, the kind of quality that announced importance without being ostentatious about it. "I'm actually not here for service on my vehicle. I'm looking for someone who works here, a mechanic named Jerome Lewis. I was told I might find him at this location." The shop seemed to go quiet for a moment as every mechanic within earshot stopped what they were doing and turned to look. Jerome, still under the Tahoe, felt his heart suddenly begin to race. He had no idea who Alexander Chen was, or why someone from Pinnacle Motors, one of the largest automotive manufacturers in the country, would be looking for him. His mind raced through possibilities, each one seeming less likely than the last. Had someone reported his truck as unsafe? Was he in some kind of trouble for his modifications? Raymond's eyebrows rose in surprise, but he quickly gestured toward the bay where Jerome was working. "Jerome? Sure, he's right over there. Can I ask what this is about?" The protective note in Raymond's voice was subtle, but present. Whatever else could be said about him, Raymond looked after his employees, and unexpected visits from corporate executives rarely meant good news for working people. Alexander Chen's expression remained pleasant, but gave nothing away. "I'd prefer to discuss that with Jerome directly, if you don't mind. It's a business matter that I think he'll be very interested in hearing about." Something in the way he said it suggested this was not a negotiation, and Raymond, recognizing the tone of someone used to getting their way, simply nodded and called out to Jerome. "Jerome, someone here to see you." Jerome carefully slid out from under the Tahoe, his mind still racing as he tried to figure out what could possibly be happening. He grabbed a shop rag and wiped his hands as he walked over, very aware that every eye in the shop was on him. The walk from the bay to where Alexander Chen stood felt like it took an eternity, each step measured and careful, as Jerome tried to maintain his composure despite the anxiety coiling in his stomach. Up close, Alexander Chen was even more impressive, the kind of person whose presence commanded attention through some combination of bearing and confidence that couldn't be faked. But as Jerome approached, something unexpected happened. The executive's professional smile widened into something more genuine, something that looked almost like excitement, and he extended his hand with evident enthusiasm. "Jerome Lewis, I've been hoping to meet you," Alexander said, his voice carrying a warmth that caught Jerome completely off guard. This was not the tone of someone who was here to deliver bad news or file a complaint. "I'm Alexander Chen from Pinnacle Motors. I wonder if we might speak privately for a few minutes. What I have to discuss is somewhat sensitive, and I think you'll want to hear it." Jerome shook the offered hand, his mind still trying to catch up with what was happening. "Of course, Mr. Chen. We could talk in the break room or—" He hesitated, then made a decision that surprised even himself. "We could talk in my truck if you prefer. It's quieter and more private." Alexander's eyes lit up at the suggestion, and his smile took on a knowing quality that made Jerome's pulse quicken. "Your truck? The modified pickup that's been the subject of some interesting reports? Yes, I think that would be perfect. In fact, I'd very much like to see it." The walk across the parking lot felt surreal. Jerome was acutely aware of his coworkers watching from the shop, probably making jokes about what could possibly be important enough for an executive to visit their strange colleague. Marcus and Danny had moved to stand in the bay door, not even pretending to work anymore, as they watched the odd pair head toward the truck that they had mocked so many times. Raymond stood in the office doorway, his expression a mixture of confusion and growing curiosity. When they reached the truck, Jerome unlocked the passenger door for Alexander and then walked around to the driver's side. The interior was surprisingly clean, despite the exterior's rough appearance, with every surface organized and maintained with the same care Jerome brought to his professional work. The dashboard had been modified with additional gauges and displays, showing information that would mean nothing to most people, but which told Jerome everything about how his system was performing at any given moment. Alexander settled into the passenger seat and took a long moment to look around, his eyes moving over the modifications with clear interest. He reached out to touch one of the small displays, his fingers tracing the edges of the installation with something close to reverence. When he spoke, his voice had dropped its corporate polish and taken on the tone of one enthusiast speaking to another. "This is remarkable work, really remarkable," Alexander said, and Jerome could hear the genuine admiration in his voice. "The integration is so clean, so thoughtful. This isn't just someone bolting parts together and hoping they work. This is engineering, real engineering, and it's being done in a way that shows a deep understanding of the underlying principles." Jerome felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized he had been carrying. Someone, finally someone, was looking at his work and seeing what he had tried to accomplish, rather than just seeing a joke or an oddity. He found his voice after a moment, though it came out rougher than he intended, weighted with emotions he had kept locked away for too long. "Thank you. I've been working on this for 5 years, ever since the idea first came to me. I knew it could work, I knew the science was sound, but getting from theory to practice has been," he paused, searching for the right word, "challenging and expensive and lonely." Alexander nodded, his expression sympathetic. "I can only imagine. Which brings me to why I'm here." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a smartphone, tapping through a few screens before turning it to show Jerome. The display showed a video, slightly grainy and clearly shot from a distance, but unmistakably showing Jerome's truck. The timestamp was from 3 weeks ago. One of our junior engineers lives in this neighborhood. He was passing by the shop one evening when you were leaving, and he noticed something unusual about your vehicle, Alexander explained, his finger scrolling through what appeared to be a series of photos and video clips. Specifically, he noticed steam coming from your exhaust, not smoke or vapor from combustion, but pure steam. Being young and curious, he took some pictures and video, and then he did what young engineers do. He posted about it on an automotive forum, asking if anyone knew what could produce that effect. Jerome's stomach dropped. He had always been so careful, but he couldn't control every moment, couldn't monitor who might be watching when he drove to and from work. He had known this day might come, when someone with enough knowledge would notice something unusual and start asking questions, but he had never imagined it would lead to this. The post caught my attention almost immediately, Alexander continued, putting his phone away and turning to face Jerome fully. I've been heading up Pinnacle's alternative fuel research division for the past 7 years. We've invested billions into developing hydrogen fuel cell technology, trying to overcome the infrastructure and efficiency problems that have kept it from becoming practical for consumer vehicles. And then I see this video of what appears to be a functioning hydrogen vehicle being driven by a mechanic in Detroit, and I had to know more. He pulled out another item from his pocket, a folded piece of paper that looked like it had been printed from a website. Jerome recognized it immediately, his breath catching as he saw his own words staring back at him. It was a post he had made on an automotive forum almost 2 years ago, describing his system in general terms and asking for feedback on some of the technical challenges he had encountered. The post had received a handful of responses, mostly skeptical, and Jerome had eventually stopped checking it. I spent the last 3 weeks tracking down everything I could find about you, Alexander said, his voice taking on the intensity of someone describing a detective story. That post, your employment history, even your patent application from 4 years ago that was denied due to lack of funds for proper documentation. I pieced together a picture of someone who had solved problems that billion-dollar research teams have been struggling with, and who had done it in their spare time with limited resources. It was, frankly, difficult to believe. Jerome felt his face grow warm. You investigated me? Thoroughly, Alexander admitted without apology. Because if what I suspected was true, if you had actually created a practical on-demand hydrogen generation system for vehicles, then I was looking at potentially the most important automotive innovation in decades. And I needed to verify it before I came here and made you an offer that my board of directors would think I was insane for making. An offer? Jerome's voice came out barely above a whisper. The world seemed to have narrowed down to just this moment, just this conversation, with everything else fading into background noise. His hands gripped the steering wheel, needing something solid to hold onto, as his entire reality shifted around him. Alexander leaned back in the seat, his expression becoming more businesslike but no less intense. I want to see it work. I want you to show me what this truck can do, explain how your system operates, and then, assuming I'm correct about what I'm going to see, I want to make you an offer that will change your life. But first, the demonstration. Can you show me? Jerome's mind raced. This was it, the moment he had dreamed about for 5 years, but had stopped believing would ever actually come. Someone from a major automotive company was sitting in his truck, asking to see his invention, treating him like a fellow engineer rather than like a joke. The temptation to seize this opportunity with both hands was almost overwhelming, but years of caution and disappointment had taught him to be careful. If I show you, Jerome said slowly, choosing his words with care, I need some assurance that this isn't just industrial espionage, that you're not going to take what I've created and disappear without giving me anything in return. I know how the world works, Mr. Chen. I know that people like me don't usually win when we go up against big corporations. Alexander's expression grew serious, and he nodded with what appeared to be genuine respect. That's smart, and I don't blame you for being cautious, which is why I'm going to do something unusual. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a document, multiple pages stapled together and covered in dense legal text. This is a standard non-disclosure agreement, but I've added some provisions that I think you'll find interesting. Read Section 4, Paragraph 3. Jerome took the document and found the indicated section. As he read, his eyes widened. The paragraph stated that if Pinnacle Motors chose to develop any technology derived from or inspired by what Jerome was about to show them, Jerome would receive either a one-time payment of $2 million or a royalty arrangement that guaranteed him a percentage of all profits from the technology for the next 20 years, whichever he preferred. Furthermore, Jerome would be offered a position as a senior consultant on the project, with a salary of no less than $300,000 annually. "I had our lawyers draw this up yesterday," Alexander explained as Jerome stared at the numbers in disbelief. "I told them I needed an NDA that would protect both parties and provide strong incentives for cooperation. They thought I was crazy, but I've learned to trust my instincts. And every instinct I have is telling me that what you've created is worth protecting and compensating appropriately." Jerome read through the entire document twice, his hands shaking slightly as he turned the pages. It all seemed legitimate. The legal language was complex but clear, and the terms were far more generous than anything he could have hoped for. But there was a part of him that still couldn't quite believe this was happening, that whispered this had to be some kind of trick or elaborate joke. "I need to call my lawyer," Jerome said, then laughed at the absurdity of his own words. "Except, I don't have a lawyer. I've never needed one before." Alexander smiled and pulled out a business card, different from the one he had given Raymond. "Call this number. Her name is Patricia Douglas, and she specializes in intellectual property and technology contracts. Tell her I gave you her number, and she'll review this document with you right now over the phone if you want. I'll step outside to give you privacy." 20 minutes later, after a surreal conversation with Patricia Douglas, who had confirmed that the contract was legitimate and actually quite favorable given the circumstances, Jerome signed his name at the bottom of the document with a pen that Alexander provided. His hand was steadier than he expected, as if some part of him had been preparing for this moment even when his conscious mind had given up hope. "All right," Jerome said, folding his copy of the NDA and tucking it carefully into his glove compartment. "Let me show you what this truck can do." He started by walking Alexander through the basic principles of the system, using the notebook he kept under the seat to illustrate the key concepts. Alexander listened with the focused attention of someone who genuinely understood what he was hearing, occasionally asking questions that showed he had a deep technical background himself. The conversation flowed naturally, two people who spoke the same language finally finding each other after years of isolation. "The key innovation," Jerome explained, his voice growing more confident as he spoke about something he knew better than anyone alive, was solving the energy efficiency problem. Traditional electrolysis requires a lot of electrical power to split water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen. Most systems lose so much energy in that conversion that the hydrogen you produce has less energy than the electricity you use to create it. It's a net loss, which is why hydrogen vehicles have always needed external infrastructure. He pointed to a diagram in his notebook, showing the solar panel array he had integrated into the truck's exterior. "I use every available surface for solar collection, not just the roof, but the hood, the bed cover, even specially designed panels built into the sides. But the real breakthrough was in the catalyst I developed for the electrolysis process. It's a platinum-ruthenium alloy with a specific crystal structure that dramatically reduces the amount of energy needed to split the water molecules." Alexander leaned forward, his eyes scanning the diagrams with evident fascination. "Platinum-ruthenium? That's not a common combination for this application. How did you arrive at that particular alloy?" Jerome smiled, remembering the long nights of experimentation in his garage. "Trial and error, honestly. I read everything I could find about electrolysis catalysts, learned which elements had the right properties, and then started testing combinations. I went through maybe 40 different formulations before I found one that worked the way I needed it to. Some of them did nothing, a few actually made things worse, but when I hit on this particular ratio and crystal structure, the efficiency jumped by almost 60% compared to standard catalysts. That's, Jerome, do you understand what you've accomplished?" Alexander's voice held a note of awe. "Research labs with millions in funding have been trying to achieve those kinds of efficiency gains for years. And you did it in your garage?" "I had motivation," Jerome said simply. "And I had time. When you don't have funding or equipment or a team, you learn to be creative. You learn to think differently because you have no choice. Maybe that's actually an advantage sometimes." He turned the key in the ignition, and the truck came to life with that distinctive soft whir followed by the gentle hiss of steam. The dashboard displays lit up, showing readouts for water levels, hydrogen production rates, battery charge, and a dozen other parameters that Jerome had learned to monitor instinctively. Everything was running smoothly, the system performing exactly as designed. "Listen," Jerome said, and Alexander cocked his head, straining to hear. The sound of the engine was remarkably quiet, nothing like the rumble of a traditional combustion engine. There was the electric whine of the motor, a sound similar to what you might hear from a golf cart, but deeper and more substantial. And beneath that, the steady whisper of the electrolysis process at work. That's hydrogen being generated in real time, exactly enough to power the fuel cell based on how much electricity the motor needs. There's never more than a few grams of hydrogen in the system at any given moment, which makes it much safer than traditional hydrogen storage. Alexander reached out to touch the dashboard, his fingers hovering over the gauges as if afraid to disturb something fragile and precious. "And the water? Where does that come from?" "Tank under the bed. Holds about 30 gallons, Jerome explained, shifting the truck into gear and beginning to drive slowly around the parking lot. "At highway speeds, I can go about 400 miles before I need to refill, which is better than most gasoline vehicles. And the only thing coming out of the exhaust is water vapor, completely clean. No carbon dioxide, no nitrogen oxides, no particulates. Just H2O. They drove around the block, Jerome pointing out various features of the system as they went. The acceleration was smooth and surprisingly strong, the electric motor providing instant torque that pushed them back in their seats when Jerome demonstrated it. The ride was quiet enough that they could talk in normal voices without having to raise their volume over engine noise. It was, in every practical way, a fully functional vehicle that happened to run on a revolutionary fuel system. When they returned to the parking lot, Jerome could see that a crowd had gathered. His coworkers stood in a loose semicircle, their expressions ranging from confusion to dawning realization. Marcus and Danny were at the front, and Jerome could see the exact moment when Marcus understood that the joke had been on them all along. Raymond stood with his arms crossed, but his face showed something that looked like pride mixed with amazement. Alexander stepped out of the truck and immediately pulled out his phone, walking a short distance away to make a call. Jerome could hear fragments of the conversation, phrases like, "even better than I hoped," and "we need to move on this immediately," and "authorize whatever funding is necessary." Each phrase felt unreal, like dialogue from a movie rather than something happening to his actual life. Marcus approached the truck cautiously, as if the vehicle might suddenly reveal itself to be dangerous after all. His voice when he spoke was subdued, lacking all of its usual bravado and mockery. "Jerome, man, what just happened? Who is that guy?" "That's Alexander Chen from Pinnacle Motors," Jerome said, surprised by how calm his own voice sounded. Inside, his emotions were a chaotic swirl of vindication, excitement, and a fear that this might somehow still fall apart. But outwardly he maintained the same quiet composure he had always shown. "He came to see my truck. He wanted to understand how it works." Danny shook his head slowly, his expression showing genuine regret. "We've been making fun of you for months, and all this time, you were building something real, something important." Jerome looked at his coworker, at the man who had laughed at him countless times, and found that he couldn't summon any anger. "I tried to explain it a few times, but I don't think I did a very good job. And honestly, I don't blame any of you for being skeptical. If someone told me they had invented a revolutionary fuel system in their garage, I'd probably laugh too." Alexander returned, his phone now put away, and his expression showing barely contained excitement. "Jerome, I just spoke with our CEO and the head of our research division. We would like to make you an offer, right now, before anyone else gets wind of what you've created. We're prepared to purchase the rights to your technology for an upfront payment of $5 million, with an additional $20 million in milestone payments as we develop it for production. You would join Pinnacle Motors as Chief Innovation Officer for Alternative Propulsion, with an annual salary of $450,000 and full benefits. You would lead the team that takes your invention and turns it into vehicles that people can buy." The silence that followed this announcement was absolute. Jerome heard the words, understood them intellectually, but his brain refused to process the emotional reality of what was being offered. $5 million. Chief Innovation Officer. An additional $20 million. The numbers were so large they seemed to lose meaning, like trying to comprehend the distance to the stars. Jerome started, then stopped, his voice failing him. He tried again. I need time to think about this, to process it. It's a lot to take in all at once. Alexander nodded, his expression understanding. Of course, take the weekend. But Jerome, I want you to understand something. What you've created here, it's not just valuable to Pinnacle Motors. Every automotive company in the world would want this technology. Some of them would be willing to do almost anything to get it. So I need you to be careful to not discuss this with anyone outside of the people in this parking lot right now, and to call me immediately if anyone else approaches you about your truck. He handed Jerome another business card, this one with a personal cell phone number written on the back in pen. Call me Monday morning with your answer. I'll have our lawyers draw up a formal contract over the weekend, and we can go through it in detail with your attorney present. But, Jerome, I really hope you'll say yes. The world needs what you've created, and Pinnacle is the company that can make it available to everyone. After Alexander Chen drove away in his luxury sedan, the parking lot of Martinez Auto Repair remained frozen in stunned silence for several long moments. Finally, Raymond walked over to Jerome, his hand extended and his eyes slightly damp. Jerome, I don't know what to say. I had no idea. None of us did. I'm sorry we didn't take you seriously. Jerome shook his boss's hand, then found himself pulled into an awkward but genuine hug. It's okay, Raymond. Really. I know how it looked from the outside. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Jerome tried to focus on his work, on the mundane tasks of replacing brake pads and diagnosing check engine lights, but his mind kept returning to the conversation in his truck, to the numbers Alexander had quoted, to the possibility that his entire life was about to change in ways he could barely imagine. His coworkers treated him differently now, not with mockery, but with a kind of cautious respect that was almost more uncomfortable than the jokes had been. That evening, Jerome drove home to the small house he rented in a neighborhood that had seen better days. The building was old but well-maintained, a 2-bedroom bungalow that he shared with absolutely no one since his mother had passed away 18 months ago. He parked his truck in the narrow driveway and sat for a long moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel, looking at the house that had been his entire world for so long. Inside, he made himself a simple dinner of chicken and rice, eating mechanically while his mind raced through scenarios and possibilities. He pulled out the business card Alexander had given him and stared at the phone number, wondering if he should call right now, if waiting until Monday was just prolonging the inevitable. But something held him back, a need to sit with this moment and let it become real before he made a decision that would alter everything. He walked through his house, seeing it with new eyes. The living room, with its second-hand furniture and the television he had bought used 5 years ago. The kitchen with appliances that were old but functional kept running through his own mechanical skills and careful maintenance. The second bedroom that he had converted into a workshop, filled with tools and materials and failed prototypes from his years of experimentation. This house represented who he was, a man who made do with what he had and found ways to create something from nothing. If he accepted Pinnacle's offer, he could buy any house he wanted. He could buy 10 houses. The thought was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. Jerome had never been wealthy, had never even been comfortable in the financial sense. His father had died when Jerome was 12, leaving his mother to raise him alone on a secretary's salary. They had always had just enough, but never more than that. Jerome had learned to fix things because buying new wasn't an option, had learned to be resourceful because waste was something they couldn't afford. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart, even though calling it always brought a mixture of comfort and pain. His sister Angela answered on the third ring, her voice bright and warm even at 9 in the evening. She lived 2 states away now, had moved to Tennessee with her husband and 2 kids, but she and Jerome still talk several times a week. "Hey, little brother, what's going on?" Angela's greeting was casual, but Jerome could hear the undertone of concern. He didn't usually call at this hour without a reason. "Angie, something happened today, something big, and I need to talk it through with someone who knows me, really knows me." Jerome's voice cracked slightly on the last words, the emotion he had been holding back all day finally finding a crack to escape through. There was a pause. And when Angela spoke again, her tone had shifted to full protective older sister mode. "Are you okay? Are you in trouble? Jerome, talk to me." He laughed, a sound that came out slightly hysterical around the edges. "I'm not in trouble. The opposite, actually. I think, Angie, I think my life just completely changed. An executive from Pinnacle Motors came to the shop today. He wants to buy my hydrogen system. He offered me $5 million, plus another $20 million later, plus a job that pays more money than I ever imagined making. The silence on the other end stretched so long that Jerome thought the call might have dropped. Then Angela's voice came back, small and disbelieving. "Say that again, slowly, because I think I just hallucinated." Jerome repeated the story, going through every detail from Alexander Chen's arrival, to the demonstration, to the offer that had been made. Angela listened without interrupting, and Jerome could picture her sitting in her kitchen, probably with her hand over her mouth the way she always did when she was shocked. When he finished, she was quiet for another long moment before speaking. "Jerome, oh my God, Jerome, you did it. You actually did it. All those years, all that work, all those nights you spent in that garage when everyone thought you were crazy. You proved them all wrong." Her voice was thick with emotion, and Jerome realized she was crying. Mom would have been so proud. Do you know that? She would have been absolutely bursting with pride. The mention of their mother hit Jerome like a physical blow. Mary Lewis had believed in him even when he had stopped believing in himself, had encouraged his experiments even when it meant eating cheaper foods so he could buy materials, had never once suggested that he was wasting his time. She had died of a heart attack 18 months ago, sudden and without warning, and Jerome had spent every day since wishing he could share one more conversation with her, tell her one more time how much her faith had meant. "I wish she could see this," Jerome said quietly. "I wish I could tell her it was all worth it." She knows, Jerome. Wherever she is, she knows. And she's probably up there telling everyone about her brilliant son who never gave up on his dream. Angela's voice was firm, pushing back against his grief with the certainty that had always been her superpower. "So, what are you going to do? Are you going to take the offer?" Jerome walked to his workshop and stood in the doorway, looking at the accumulated evidence of his obsession. "I don't know. Part of me wants to say yes immediately, to grab this opportunity before it disappears. But another part of me is terrified. What if I can't do the job they're offering me? What if I take their money and then disappoint them? I'm just a mechanic, Angie. I fix transmissions and do oil changes. I'm not an executive." "Stop that right now," Angela said sharply. "You are not just a mechanic. You are an inventor who solved problems that people with doctoral degrees and unlimited funding couldn't solve. You are a self-taught engineer who created something revolutionary in your spare time with limited resources. Don't you dare diminish what you've accomplished because you don't have the right pieces of paper on your wall." Her words settled something in Jerome's chest, quieting some of the doubt that had been gnawing at him. "You're right. I know you're right. It's just hard to change how I think about myself." "Then start practicing," Angela said firmly. "Because as of today, you're not the guy people laugh at anymore. You're the guy who's about to change the automotive industry. So you better get used to thinking of yourself that way, because everyone else is about to start seeing you like that, whether you're ready or not." They talked for another hour, Angela asking questions about the technical details that Jerome patiently explained, both of them marveling at how quickly everything had shifted. By the time they hung up, Jerome felt more grounded, more certain that this was real and that he could handle whatever came next. He went to bed that night and surprisingly slept better than he had in months. The weekend passed in a strange suspension of time. Jerome spent Saturday morning cleaning his house and doing laundry, normal, mundane tasks that felt surreal given what was hanging over his head. In the afternoon, he drove to his mother's grave, something he did every few weeks when the loneliness of missing her became too heavy to carry alone. He sat on the grass beside her headstone and told her everything, the whole story from beginning to end, and he could almost hear her voice responding with a pride and encouragement. Sunday brought an unexpected complication. Jerome was in his garage, tinkering with his truck, not because it needed work, but because working with his hands helped him think, when a car pulled into his driveway. It was another luxury vehicle, though this one was a different brand than Alexander's, and the man who stepped out wore a suit that looked even more expensive. He was younger than Alexander, maybe 35, with the aggressive confidence of someone who was used to getting what they wanted. "Jerome Lewis, my name is Bradley Hutchins, and I represent Quantum Automotive Technologies. I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time." The man's smile was wide and bright, but something about it made Jerome immediately wary. This felt different from Alexander's visit, less like respect between equals and more like a predator sizing up prey. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hutchins, but I'm not available to talk right now," Jerome said carefully, remembering Alexander's warning about being cautious. "If you want to reach me, you can call me during business hours." Bradley's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened slightly. "I think you'll want to hear what I have to say. We're prepared to offer you $7 million for your hydrogen technology plus royalties. That's more than Pinnacle is offering you, I'd wager. Considerably more." Jerome felt his stomach clench. How did this man know about Pinnacle's offer? Had someone from the shop talked despite Alexander's request for discretion? Or was Quantum monitoring Pinnacle's movements? Either way, the situation felt wrong in a way he couldn't quite articulate. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Hutchins, but I'm not interested in discussing my work with anyone right now. I'll have to ask you to leave." The younger man's expression shifted, the friendly mask slipping to reveal something harder beneath. "Be smart about this, Jerome. Pinnacle is a dying company, losing market share every quarter. Quantum is the future. We have the resources to develop your technology faster and better than they ever could. You'd be making a mistake to tie yourself to the wrong partner. Please leave my property," Jerome said, his voice quiet but firm. He pulled his phone from his pocket, letting Bradley see him hold it. "Now." Bradley stared at him for a long moment, then shrugged and returned to his car. But before he drove away, he rolled down his window and called out, "You have my card in your mailbox. Think about it. Really think about whether you want to bet your future on Pinnacle's sinking ship." After the car disappeared around the corner, Jerome found that his hands were shaking. He went inside and immediately called the number Alexander had given him, relieved when the executive answered on the second ring, despite it being a Sunday afternoon. "Jerome, is everything all right?" Alexander's voice carried immediate concern, as if he had been expecting this call. Jerome explained what had happened, describing Bradley Hutchins and the offer from Quantum. Alexander listened without interrupting, but Jerome could hear him typing rapidly in the background. When Jerome finished, Alexander let out a long breath that sounded angry and frustrated. "Quantum Automotive. I should have expected this. They've been trying to poach our research for years." Bradley Hutchins is their head of competitive intelligence, which is a polite way of saying corporate espionage. "Jerome, this is important. Do not, under any circumstances, discuss your technology with them or accept any offers they make. They have a reputation for acquiring patents and then burying them to prevent competition with their existing product lines." "I didn't tell him anything," Jerome assured him. "But how did he know about your offer? I haven't told anyone except my sister, and she wouldn't say anything to anyone." "Someone at the shop probably mentioned it, maybe not realizing what they were doing. Word travels fast in industry circles, especially when something potentially revolutionary is involved. The fact that Quantum moved this quickly means they're desperate to keep us from securing your technology." Alexander paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had taken on a new urgency. "Jerome, I know I said to take the weekend to think about it, but I'm going to ask you to make a decision now. Not because I want to pressure you, but because I'm genuinely concerned about what Quantum might try next. They have more money than ethics, and they're not above using questionable tactics to get what they want." Jerome walked to his window and looked out at the street, half expecting to see Bradley's car lurking somewhere nearby. The quiet neighborhood that had always felt safe now seemed full of potential threats, his invention suddenly making him a target rather than a joke. The weight of the decision pressed down on him. Demanding resolution. "What happens if I say yes to your offer?" Jerome asked. "What's the timeline? What changes immediately?" "We'd have lawyers at your house tomorrow with contracts. You'd sign over the patent rights and technical documentation in exchange for the initial payment, which would be in your bank account within 48 hours. We'd arrange for secure storage of your truck at one of our research facilities. And you'd start your new position at Pinnacle on the 1st of next month, which gives us time to set up your office and assemble your team." Alexander spoke with the confidence of someone who had already planned every step of this process. "Jerome, I meant what I said about this technology being important, not just for Pinnacle, but for everyone. We need to get it to market before it gets buried by companies that see it as a threat rather than an opportunity." Jerome thought about his mother, about the faith she had always had in him. He thought about the 5 years he had spent working on his invention, the sacrifices and setbacks and small victories that had brought him to this moment. He thought about what Angela had said, about needing to see himself differently, to step into the role that his accomplishments had earned him. And he thought about Bradley Hutchins and the veiled threat in his words, the implication that choosing wrong could cost Jerome everything. "I'll do it," Jerome said. And as the words left his mouth, he felt something shift inside him, fear transmuting into determination. "I'll sign with Pinnacle, but I want my lawyer present for all the contracts. And I want guarantees in writing that my name stays attached to this technology, that people will know it came from me." "Absolutely," Alexander said, and Jerome could hear the relief in his voice. "You'll get full credit, Jerome. This will be the Lewis hydrogen system, and your name will be on every patent and every vehicle that uses your technology. I'll have the legal team add provisions to ensure that. Can you meet me at our downtown office tomorrow morning at 9? Bring your lawyer, bring your sister if you want. Bring anyone who you trust to help you review the contracts." They talked for a few more minutes, working out the details, and then Jerome hung up and sat down heavily on his couch. His phone buzzed almost immediately with a text from Angela, just 3 words followed by a string of celebration emojis. "So proud of you." Monday morning arrived with the weight of finality. Jerome woke before his alarm, showered and dressed in the one good suit he owned, a charcoal gray outfit he had bought for his mother's funeral and had barely worn since. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. The same face, the same eyes. But something fundamental had changed. The mechanic who had been mocked and dismissed was gone, replaced by someone who was about to walk into one of the largest automotive companies in America as an equal. Patricia Douglas, the lawyer Alexander had recommended, met Jerome in the lobby of Pinnacle Motors headquarters at 8:45. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who exuded competence and a no-nonsense attitude that immediately put Jerome at ease. They had spoken on the phone twice over the weekend, and she had already reviewed preliminary versions of the contracts, making notes and preparing questions. "Remember, Jerome, you have all the power here," Patricia said, as they rode the elevator up to the executive floor. "They want what you have, which means you can negotiate terms. Don't let them rush you into signing anything you're not completely comfortable with." The conference room they were led to was larger than Jerome's entire living room, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the Detroit skyline. Alexander was there, along with 3 other executives, including an older woman who was introduced as Catherine Reeves, the CEO of Pinnacle Motors. Her handshake was firm, her eyes assessing, but not unkind. "Mr. Lewis, thank you for coming. Alexander has told me remarkable things about your invention, and I'm very excited about the possibility of bringing it to our customers." Catherine gestured to the chairs around the massive conference table. "Please sit. I understand you have counsel with you, which is excellent. We want this to be a partnership built on trust and mutual respect." The next 4 hours were a blur of legal language and technical discussions. Patricia went through the contracts line by line, negotiating changes and clarifications, while Jerome sat and tried to follow along. The numbers that had seemed unreal when Alexander first mentioned them became concrete as they were written into legal documents. $5 million as an initial payment, $20 million more in milestone payments tied to development benchmarks, an annual salary of $450,000 as Chief Innovation Officer, with benefits and stock options that Patricia assured him were extraordinarily generous. But beyond the money, there were provisions that mattered even more to Jerome. His name would be prominently displayed on all patents. He would have final approval over how the technology was marketed and presented to the public. He would lead a team of engineers in developing the system for mass production, with significant autonomy in how that team operated. And perhaps most importantly, there was a clause that prevented Pinnacle from shelving the technology. If they didn't make good faith efforts to bring it to market within 5 years, the rights would revert to Jerome. "This is fair," Patricia whispered to Jerome during a break while the Pinnacle lawyers consulted among themselves. "More than fair, actually. I've never seen a corporation give this much control to an individual inventor. They must really want this badly." Catherine overheard the comment and smiled. "We do want it badly, but that's not the only reason for these terms. The truth is, we've watched too many brilliant innovations die because corporations bought them and then buried them or mangled them beyond recognition. This technology is too important for that. We want Jerome invested not just financially, but personally in making this succeed. That means giving him the power to protect his vision. At 12:30 in the afternoon, Jerome Lewis signed his name at the bottom of the contract. His hand was steady, the signature clear and bold. Alexander immediately shook his hand, then surprised Jerome by pulling him into a brief hug. The other executives applauded, a sound that felt absurd and wonderful at the same time. "Welcome to Pinnacle Motors, Jerome," Catherine said warmly. "You're going to change the world. I truly believe that." The rest of the day passed in a daze. There were photographs for the press release that Pinnacle was preparing, though they agreed to delay its publication for a week to give Jerome time to prepare for the attention it would bring. There was a tour of the research and development facility where Jerome would be working, a massive complex filled with equipment and resources that made his garage workshop look like a child's toy box. There were introductions to the team of engineers who would be working under his direction, smart young people with advanced degrees who looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. By the time Jerome left the Pinnacle building that evening, his head was spinning and his phone was full of text messages from Angela demanding updates. But before he went home, there was one stop he needed to make. He drove back to Martinez Auto Repair, arriving just as the shop was closing for the day. The parking lot was nearly empty, just Raymond's truck and Marcus's sedan still present. Raymond was in his office, going through paperwork with the resigned expression of someone tackling an unpleasant but necessary task. He looked up when Jerome knocked on the doorframe, and his face broke into a genuine smile. "Jerome! Didn't expect to see you today. How did it go?" "I signed the contract," Jerome said simply. "I'm leaving the shop. My last day will be 2 weeks from now." Raymond stood and came around the desk, his expression shifting from happy to bittersweet. "I'm glad for you, truly I am. But I'm going to miss having you here. You're the best mechanic I've ever employed, but more than that, you're a good man. The shop won't be the same without you." They talked for a while about logistics and transition plans, about how Jerome would finish up his current projects and help train someone to take over his responsibilities. It was practical conversation, but underneath it was the recognition that this was the end of an era. Jerome had been at Martinez Auto Repair for 3 years, and despite the mocking he had endured, there had been good moments too. Raymond had been a fair boss, and some of his coworkers had been genuinely kind, even if they hadn't understood his passion. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space. He looked uncomfortable, his hands shoved into his pockets and his eyes not quite meeting Jerome's. "Hey man, heard you were here. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. For all the jokes, all the times I gave you a hard time about your truck. I was wrong, and I should have respected what you were trying to do, even if I didn't understand it." Jerome looked at the man who had been his primary tormentor for months and found that he genuinely couldn't hold on to any anger. "It's okay, Marcus. Really, I know how it looked. And honestly, part of me is grateful for the skepticism because it made me work harder to prove the concept. So in a weird way, you kind of helped." Marcus laughed, a sound of surprised relief. "Only you would find a way to thank someone for being a jerk to them. You're a better person than I am, Jerome Lewis." He stuck out his hand, and Jerome shook it firmly. "Good luck with everything. I mean that. Go change the world, or whatever it is that geniuses do." The 2 weeks that followed were strange. Jerome continued showing up at the shop each morning, continued doing the work he had always done, but everything felt different. His coworkers treated him with a deference that was uncomfortable, asking his opinion on things that had nothing to do with his invention, talking about him in hushed, almost reverent tones when they thought he couldn't hear. The truck that had been a source of mockery was now regarded as a kind of holy relic, with people coming by just to look at it and take pictures. News of the deal had leaked despite Pinnacle's attempts to control the narrative. Automotive blogs and tech news sites ran stories about the mysterious mechanic who had invented a revolutionary hydrogen system. Some of the coverage was positive, highlighting Jerome's self-taught expertise and determination. Other coverage was skeptical, with experts questioning whether the technology could really work as described, or suggesting that Pinnacle was wasting money on an unproven system. Jerome tried not to read the articles, but it was impossible to completely ignore the sudden scrutiny. Reporters started calling, asking for interviews and comments. Jerome declined them all, following the advice of Pinnacle's public relations team, who assured him they would handle all media inquiries until the official announcement. But the attention was unsettling, a reminder that his life was no longer private, that every move he made would now be watched and analyzed by people he had never met. His last day at Martinez Auto Repair fell on a Friday, appropriately enough. The shop threw him a small party during lunch, with Raymond providing pizza and sodas while everyone gathered in the break room to wish him well. There were jokes, inevitably, about Jerome buying the whole shop once his technology made him rich, but the jokes were affectionate now, rather than mocking. Danny gave a short speech about how Jerome had taught him to look deeper when diagnosing problems, to not just treat symptoms, but find root causes. Marcus presented Jerome with a framed photograph of the infamous truck, with all the shop employees gathered around it, grinning like idiots.